Good afternoon, everyone. We're thrilled to welcome you to today's Virginia Extension Master Gardener Continuing Education webinar. I'm your host, Ed Olson, the State Extension Master Gardener Program Director. Get ready for exciting things. Over the coming months, we'll have a variety of knowledgeable speakers joining us virtually. Be sure to check the EMG biweekly update for upcoming webinars. You'll find registration links and detailed information there. A few housekeeping notes. Recording. This session is being recorded, and you'll find the link in the chat box shortly for later viewing. And then feel free to use the chat box throughout the presentation to ask questions for our speaker. We'll address them at the end and answer as many as we can. Liv will also share her contact information at the end of the program, and you can reach out to her directly with additional questions. Now let's give a warm welcome to our speaker today, Liv Andrews. Liv is a PhD student with Dr. Scott Solomon's Forestry Entomology Lab of Virginia Tech's Department of Entomology. Liv will be discussing an overview of invasive forest insect pests in Virginia. Liv, you can go ahead and start.
Okay, there, we figured out how to unmute. All right, hello everyone. Thanks for joining. I won't reintroduce myself, but yeah, so hopefully today you'll learn about Okay, can everybody hear me? Yes, perfect, I'm unmuted. All right, so let's get started. So I want to start quickly by just kind of putting a little plug out there. The Virginia Department of Forestry, they produce this newsletter twice a year, and they kind of gear their focus on the most important insects, pathogens, or even abiotic disturbances that affect the health and the management of our forests. So this is a really, really great resource if anybody's interested in, each year, a couple times a year, figuring out what's the up and coming issue happening in Virginia. So again, at the end, if anybody has these, there's going to be a bunch of links, and if anybody's interested, please reach out to me, and I can even provide Ed with these links to send out as well. So if we look a little bit more closely at the bottom of that issue, we can see the different pests that are highlighted, and you'll notice that both native and non-native pests are there. And I bring this up because over time, non-native pests or these threats to our forests have increased in numbers with these frequent new introductions. Now, there's a lot of reasons for these introductions. One of the biggest reasons being international trade has been this huge factor of why we're seeing more non-native pests. And they're able to get a foothold in our environment for two really big reasons. One, the trees we have here, our native trees, haven't co-evolved with the pests that are coming from a non-native area. And number two, being that the natural enemy complex that they have in their native range, like predators and parasitoids and different pathogens, we generally don't have those organisms in the new area that they're being introduced to. So there's both susceptible trees and no natural enemies that are allowing these non-native pests to kind of find their niche. So I could talk all day about different non-native and native pests, but today we're going to focus on non-native pests. And the way in forest entomology that we categorize different pests is a lot of the times the damage that they cause. So here we're going to go over 5 different pests. I'm going to talk about a defoliator, a sucking pest, and a couple wood borers, and then we'll talk about a general ground dweller that we actually don't have here in this part of Virginia yet, but it'll probably be here soon. So moving forward, so we're going to talk about the defoliator first. I kind of skipped over talking about spotted lanternfly. I'm sure you guys have kind of heard a lot about that, but we're going to talk about spongy moth as our main defoliator here. So spongy moth, or the scientific name Lomantria dispar, has been a resident of Virginia since 1980. So it started in Northern Virginia and it spread southwest. It was actually first discovered in Massachusetts in 1900. And it's actually been, if you think about that, that's over 100 years, and it's moving fairly slow. Its dispersal, which we'll talk about. So in the top left corner here, you'll see 2 moths, and the white one is actually the female. So they're sexually dimorphic. And while it has wings, what's really interesting about the female is they're non-mobile. So they can walk, but they can't fly. And then the male is brown in color, so a little bit more camouflaged. And if you look below that, you'll see the larval stage, the caterpillar, and it's a super distinct caterpillar, super easy to identify. They have these little tufts of hair, and they have 6 pairs of red dots and then 5 pair of blue dots closer to their head. And again, the main damage they cause is defoliation. And this picture here on the top right, you'll see them just munching away at the leaves. And while that's just one little branch of a tree, if you look at the impact that they can cause as a whole, there's a whole stand here in the bottom right picture. And it's kind of hard to tell, but that discoloration on that mountain range is complete defoliation. Now, I mentioned that they were first found in 1900 up in Massachusetts, an accidental release. There's a whole story behind that. It's super interesting. If I had more time, I'd love to talk about it. But again, it's been over 100 years, and it's been a pretty gradual spread. And we talked about the non-mobile female, which has really helped slow that spread. But speaking of slow the spread, we do have this really awesome program that called Slow the Spread, which I'll get into as well. Now, talking about the host plants of spongy moth, there's a lot of different host plants. We label them in these 3 different classes. Class 1 is going to be these their favored plants. These are trees and shrubs that all stages of the caterpillar, the life stages, will feed on. And this is quite the list. You can see they'll feed on overstory trees like oaks and willows, and they'll also feed on some understory like alder and hawthorn as well. Class 2, which I don't have listed here, I could only fit so much on the screen, but again, there's a link here to Bartlett that can shows all of the tree host preferences of the spongy moth. And a lot of times you'll see gypsy moth as well in these links, and that was because the common name was formerly gypsy moth, changed to spongy moth in 2022. And then there's the class 3 host plants, and those are going to be the ones that are rarely eaten by the caterpillars, a lot of the overstory trees. And I think I might have skipped over class 2, but those are going to be trees and shrubs eaten by caterpillars that are greater than 1 inch in length, I believe. If we look at their life cycle, this is a really awesome diagram here. It kind of shows not only the different life stages, but also the different control mechanisms that are being implemented at these different life stages. So you'll see that the longest time that they're present for is actually in their egg mass stage. So in the egg mass stage is present from like late summertime until about late April. And then you'll see the eggs start hatching. You'll see the caterpillars come out and begin feeding. The caterpillars will then pupate in about like mid-June. And then the adults will emerge in late summertime. So again, what's really interesting here is there's different control methods that you're going to be deploying, and that's very dependent on what life stage you're working with, which we'll talk about. So I'll throw a lot of different graphs and maps at you, but hopefully I can explain them pretty well. And again, if you guys have any questions, feel free at the end. We can go back and talk about stuff and really dig a little bit deeper. But this map here is the dark blue that you're seeing is going to represent where the spongy moth was established as of 2017. Now, what their strategy is they're monitoring the spread. If you can see these little tiny light blue areas along the edge of the dark blue, these are going to be monitoring areas where they use pheromone-baited trapping to predict outbreaks. And this kind of allows the management decisions to be made in these surrounding areas. So then this green area that you'll see, it's a little bit thicker along the established area there, that's the actual management zone. So this was a map, I think, of the management zone, the action area, they called it in 2021. So this is where they're, taking action and performing these different control mechanisms that we'll talk about in order to slow that spread of the establishment of spongy moth. So what's really interesting, historically, spongy moth populations have kind of been this pattern of boom or bust. So this graph here, you'll see on the y-axis, it's the thousands of acres, and on the x-axis, you'll see these are across the years. And you'll see, these really distinct spikes. And without a full complex of natural enemies and a more resistant population of trees, these populations are really able to explode compared to what they do in their native range. So under natural situations, they'll use a virus, it's called NPV, would typically cause these outbreak populations to crash. It stands for nuclear polyhedrosis virus. And there's a fungus actually that's more recently been being deployed that's specific to spongy moth and native to Asia, where the spongy moth comes from. And it's actually believed to be responsible for kind of causing these like busts in populations with these fluctuations, which we'll talk a little bit more about the fungus and the virus later. If we look at the defoliation in Virginia, again, this is another one of those maps looking at the acreage on the y-axis and then the year on the x-axis. This also includes fall cankerworm, which is another pest we're not going to talk about today, but again, shows those like boom and bust populations where one year you'll have a lot of defoliation and another year you might not have a lot. And one thing to note about defoliation when it comes to forest pests, right? If you're driving actually up 81 this time of year, you'll start to see all these our eastern tent caterpillars. If you're driving along, you'll see it kind of looks like in the crotch of the tree, there'll be like a little nest there, and they'll come out and defoliate the tree. But defoliation a lot of times doesn't harm the tree if the tree has a time to refoliate or it's not too late in the season. But sometimes these repeated defoliation incidents can really cause a lot of damage. This one's a really interesting map because it's depicting Virginia itself. You'll see this shows the frequency of defoliation in years throughout Virginia. And again, we mentioned that it's spreading from the north to the south and west. So you'll see there's more frequency of defoliation kind of towards the north part of Virginia because it's been established there much longer. Now, what I think, sometimes you'll see a tree defoliated here and there. I know my parents back home, they go nuts because their trees are going to get defoliated in the driveway and the caterpillars will just drop from the trees on our cars. But when you really take a step back and you look at the defoliation from afar, you can really see how great the damage is. So if we look at these pictures, these are recent aerial images in 2022. Again, all of that, those brown patchy spots are completely defoliated by spongy moth. And again, this is another aerial image from 2023. You can see how widespread that defoliation is. And if we look at what an infestation looks like, kind of looks similar to spotted lanternfly, where they kind of cake the sides of the trees and it's super gross. They'll lay their egg masses. They're really, really distinctive on the bark of the tree as well. So this is kind of what an infestation looks like. And in an effort to really slow the spread of spongy moth, this is that ongoing slow the spread program that has been put into place across the range of spongy moth. I mentioned that there's 3 specific areas when it comes to controlling that we're working towards to stop that quick spread. And luckily, again, the females they can't fly, so that helps in itself to slow their spread. But we have those 3 areas. We have behind the boundary, which is the already established area. So we're not looking to eradicate. At that point, we're just looking to suppress populations. And then within the boundary, right, we're looking at that action. This is where we're monitoring and gonna apply applications of different management tactics. And then beyond the boundary is the area that it hasn't arrived to yet. So that's where we're hopeful to eradicate. If they are passing that boundary, we want to get rid of them so that they're not establishing. And Slow the Spread's a really awesome program. I think it's an open source website, so you're more than welcome to get on. I can send you those links to look at. There's all sorts of different data that you can look at, but I think the stats was they stop the spread for like 7 million acres a year of being newly infested. So I think they've successfully reduced to like greater than 60% of the spread, which is about 3 to 13 miles per year, which is really awesome. Now, if we think about spongy moth management, right? How are we managing it? I love these figures. This was, I think the Forest Service posted these, and this was back in the 1930s, how they were managing. And I mean, you can see these people, these defoliated trees, people are walking on the limbs, just scraping egg masses off and treating them. And they were spraying, I mean, this is, Rachel Carson would be very upset if she saw these pictures of them spraying this DDT out the back of a truck. It's absolutely, we've made leaps and bounds with management, since the 30s. And if we get in to talk about management today, I just like to include those pictures because it's so interesting to see, what were we doing back then. And these are the list of the current materials that are currently being used to suppress spongy moth. And as you can see, they're a little bit different than, your grandfather's kind of pesticides. But due to the sensitive nature of the forests, right, we want to use something that's environmentally sensitive and minimize those secondary non-target effects to the environment. So the couple that I really want to point out, you may have heard of BT. It's a bacteria that has been formulated into an insecticide that is sprayed onto the tree. The larvae, so the caterpillars, will crawl and eat the leaf material, ingest those toxins, and the bacteria will break down their midgut and in turn kill the insect. So it's very specific to the larvae of moths and butterflies, and so they're the only susceptible organisms. Another one I want to mention is that fungus I had talked about from the native range in Asia of spongy moth. It's naturally occurring, and it really can't be managed, but the fungus really kind of will come out and be active during like some wet springs and help really suppress those outbreaks as well. The last one that is most widely used has been pheromone disruptant. We call this mating disruption, which is super fascinating. Disparler is the female pheromone that what they'll do is they'll fly over with planes and kind of just drop these, it's almost like little tiny flakes, and these flakes will release the pheromone under the forest canopy, and the smell will kind of permeate, and it really confuses the males. So it's like the males can't find a female and to mate with, and then they can't reproduce. So it's been pretty cost competitive, and it's super effective in managing these populations when they're kind of low to moderate population sizes. So this is the slow the spread kind of, this is what the website looks like. Again, I can pass out these links if anybody's interested. This right here is kind of the archive dashboards for the treatments that have been used in the past. So they have these treatment statistics since the early 2000s, since slow the spread's been implemented. And you can see they didn't really pick the best color scheme here, but this top the top portion of the graph that shows what treatment's been used the most, that is the mating disruption that I had mentioned. And then the second most used method below that is the BT. So that's that bacteria that's very targeting towards spongy moth. So that's kind of all I have for spongy moth. I'm gonna move on to another pest, but again, if you have any questions, we can come back at the end. So I'm going to talk about Hemlock woolly adelgid. We're going to switch to another invasive. This is what we call a sucking pest, and this is actually what I study for my PhD. It's an aphid-like insect that literally sucks the life out of our eastern and Carolina hemlocks, our two native hemlock species that we have here in the eastern US. My favorite tree, it has a special place in my heart. So this is my favorite things to talk about, obviously, but it's super devastating. If we look here, at the background picture, you'll see all those dead trees again. And what's causing that is a really, really tiny insect. It sticks its mouth parts into the base of the needle, and it feeds on the starch reserves of the tree, and it produces that white, woolly, fluffy ovisac for protection. So if you peel back that white, fluffy ovisac and look inside, there's a really tiny insect that's feeding on the starch reserves of the tree. It causes needle drop, branch dieback, and then eventually tree death. And if we look at the place of origin, right? So where did this invasive come from? It was actually hard to figure out at first until we did some molecular work. But this map here shows all of the different hemlock species that we have in the world. And it was determined via DNA analysis that showed that the hemlock woolly adelgid that we have here in the eastern US is from Japan. So it was actually first found in Richmond, Virginia in 1951, and it's now spread throughout almost our entire range of our native Eastern and Carolina hemlock. So it came on ornamental. It's thought to have come from ornamental hemlocks from Japan on nursery stock. And HWA co-evolved with all hemlock species that you see here, except the two that we have here in eastern United States. So there is a western hemlock woolly adelgid strain that's found on western hemlock out in the Pacific Northwest, but that's not the one that we have here in the US that came from Japan. So that's a little fact to carry, which we'll explain when we talk about it'll make more sense when we start talking about biocontrol. And if we look at the impact that hemlock woolly adelgid has, or I'll also refer to it from HWA here on out, we see this is what a really, really healthy hemlock stand forest really looks like. But once you see defoliation, right, or defoliation, sorry, once you see needle drop and the crown dying back, this decline can happen in a matter of like a few years. And old trees are really susceptible, and it really opens up the understory and exposes the understory, or even understory trees can be affected as well. And when you see that overstory along streams, right? Hemlock's a really unique tree. They're found on north-facing slopes. They like the cool, moist soil, and they provide really, really great coverage to our streams. And when there's not really an adequate replacement, so when you take away those trees, our stream temperatures will rise, and that in turn is going to affect, like our native brook trout, super important as well. So they're a really, really important tree. And when you remove those from the environment, it could be really detrimental to our ecosystems as a whole. This is a picture that Dr. Salem actually took when he was in the Great Smokies, and you can see this entire stand on this slope was completely wiped out. All the hemlocks were killed. And it's just amazing to think what such a tiny insect can do. And sometimes it's like, when I first started, I remember thinking, how does such a small insect do stuff like that? And when you learn about their life cycle, it's really interesting to think. So they have 2 generations per year, but one thing to note is they're all females. So they're parthenogenic insects, meaning they don't need a male to reproduce. So they have 2 generations. So you'll see this is kind of the phenology. We'll see this a couple more times where in July, they will lay the eggs will hatch, and they'll crawl to the new growth of the tree. They'll settle in and they go dormant. So they're dormant throughout the summer. And then in October, they break their dormancy and begin developing throughout the winter. And then they'll produce that white fluffy ovisac, which they lay their eggs in for protection. And then that gives rise to our second generation. We call the Progredians. They're a much faster generation, present from about March to June. And then because they're all female, it just results in this anholocyclic life cycle. So it's actually been shown that one adelgid can infest an entire tree. So that's why such a tiny insect can cause such a really big impact. And they do have a limited expansion north due to cold temperatures. So I mentioned that the HWA strain that we have here came from southern Japan. And if we look at the longitude, it actually lines up with kind of the southernmost range of the native range of our hemlocks. And one of the biggest mortality factors of HWA is this moderate to very cold temperature drop. So they can withstand the cold temperatures, but I think not this past December, but the December before it was like 55 degrees, and then we had like a 5-degree cold snap. And it caused about 90 to 99% mortality. But again, one adelgid is all it takes. So because they're all female, it's really easy for them to rebound in their populations. So adelgids are really unique when it comes to plant feeding insects because they don't have any parasitoids associated with them. Now, There is a generalist fungi and predators that are considered opportunists, but there's not a significant impact in regulating their populations. But we do have adelgid-specific predators and species-specific predators. So we're shifting gears now towards biological control. And this is kind of my niche and what I'm really working on for my projects and my research. So these are, I'm going to introduce you to some HWA-specific predators in the genus Laricobius. So all Laricobius all Laricobius species around the world are actually known as adelgid feeders. So the top one you'll see is Laricobius nigrinus, is native to Western North America, found on Western Hemlock. And Laricobius rubidus is found in Eastern North America. It actually feeds on pine bark adelgid, and sometimes you'll find it on Hemlock woolly adelgid. So that's an adelgid-specific predator, but not species-specific. Now, Laricobius osakensis, another Laricobius beetle, is actually found in Japan, only associated with Hemlock woolly adelgid there, which ironically, again, is the same strain that we have here. Now, both Laricobius nigrinus, that top species, and Laricobius osakensis on the bottom, we've actually released here in the eastern US, and they've established and are causing significant impact on that winter generation of HWA. So super exciting stuff. We're seeing an impact on populations. And if we look at their phenology, the beetle, the predator's phenology, compared to the adelgid phenology, which you see up top, you can see that they're pretty synchronous. So they actually have a subterranean portion of their life cycle where they're in the soil and they break dormancy at the same time that the adelgid does. And they'll begin feeding on some early instars, later instars. And what's really, really cool is the predator will lay its egg inside that white fluffy ovisac of the adelgid, so that when the larva hatches, it's like a buffet. They can just start feeding on those adelgid eggs. And then the larvae, when they're ready to drop to the soil and pupate, they'll fall to the ground, and then the cycle continues. So they have one generation per year. A really important thing about biocontrol agents is being able to rear them. So at Virginia Tech, we have been rearing the Laricobius beetles for 20 years. We go out in the field, look for HWA on Eastern Hemlock. We cut it down, we bring it back to the lab, put the adult beetles on the food in these little rearing containers where they'll lay eggs. We then take those the foliage, the bouquets, and we put them in these in the bottom right. You'll see these racks with larval funnels. And what's really cool is they'll feed, and then just like they drop to the soil in the field, they'll drop to the bottom of this cup. We can take them and move the larva into these pupation containers, which are just containers with soil in them. And then in October, the adult beetles are still emerging, and we ship them out into the field for releases. So it's super interesting. It took quite a few years to figure out because, again, insects, they're very picky sometimes when it comes to rearing. So speaking of picky, we'll talk about the next predator that I'm actually working on when it comes to my research. This is the new predator that we're working on called, there are two silver flies in the family Chemimiidae. So they're tiny flies that are also native to Western North America, found associated with high densities of Hemlock woolly adelgid out west. So we're not able to rear these guys yet. We haven't figured that out. But so we're relying on captures of Western foliage. We get shipped to us at the quarantine facility here at Virginia Tech, and we rear out adult flies. And I'm working boots on the ground, trying to release these flies and also understand what their ultimate impact on HWA could be. And you're probably wondering, why do we need another predator? We already have the beetles that I talked about. But I mentioned that the beetles drop to the soil to complete development. And if you see here, after the beetles drop, the second generation, where you'll see the progrediens, that shorter generation, they lay eggs in the late summer in July, and there's nothing feeding on them. And I mentioned that they're all female, so it's really easy for their populations to rebound. But these flies are actually active after the beetles drop to the soil. So we think that this could kind of be like a tag team effort where we incorporate both predators and can have an even bigger impact on these populations. So that's biological control. But again, we also have chemical control that is available and effective, especially in the urban and landscape settings or for high value trees, right? At the forest stand setting, chemical control, it's just, it doesn't make a lot of sense economically and environmentally. But there are different soil drench or soil treatments and stem treatments as well that you can perform in the landscape settings and urban settings. Soil applications normally can last a little bit longer because they can persist in the soil as the tree takes them up. The stem treatments, like stem injections, they'll work quicker because you're injecting straight into the tree, but they only last for like 1 to 2 years. And this is a really, really great guide, a publication that provides managers with different scenarios for implementing this, integrated pest management tactic when it comes to attacking and handling hemlock woolly adelgid as a whole. So a really, really great resource, and that I suggest that anybody who may be looking at managing some hemlock woolly adelgid really takes a look at. So now shifting gears, I wanted to talk a little bit about emerald ash borer, which you may have heard of. It is another invader from Asia, where it's native. This insect is beautiful. I mean, I think it's a beautiful insect, but it causes such damage. And ash trees in their native environment are actually in Asia not susceptible, but all species of ash, like the green ash and white ash that we have here in North America, are susceptible. So the insect in the larval stage will bore into the bark and feed. They kind of develop on the cambial tissue in the ash tree, and they have 1 generation per year. Generally the insect overwinter as pupa and inside the tree, and then they'll emerge as adults, I think in like May. And the males and females will mate, they'll lay the eggs on the bark, and then again, it's like that cycle. The larva will hatch and then bore in through the bark and begin feeding on the phloem tissue, and then they'll kind of scour the outer sapwood, and which is where you may have heard or have seen these S-shaped galleries. So it is really characteristic of emerald ash borer infestations. You see these S-shaped galleries in the tree. Another really key characteristic is those D-shaped emergence holes. And you're probably wondering, well, why? I mean, why D-shaped? And what's really cool, these emerald ash borer belongs to the family Buprestidae, and which is a term for flat-headed beetles. So the reason it's D-shaped is because they have this flat head. So that's super characteristic of emerald ash borer. So if you're in the field and you're wondering, you see a tree with a D-shaped emergence hole and maybe an ash tree, it was probably an emerald ash borer. So this is the native range of emerald ash borer in Asia. And when it came to the United States, it was actually first introduced to southern Michigan in 2002. And this is the upper map here in 2005. All those little red dots are infestations. And if you fast forward to 2007, that bigger map, you'll see even more infestations. And since then, it's now spread. This map is from 2022, and it's established throughout most of the United States, east of the Missouri River. And if you're wondering what the prime culprit of the movement of emerald ash borer is, it is actually firewood moved by campers. So this is kind of like why you see the big pitch for don't move your firewood, because you could be the transportation mode for these emerald ash borers to get around. This is just another map. I know I'm throwing a bunch of maps at you, but this is kind of just shows that it covers a really, really huge portion of the native range of our ash here. It's killed hundreds of millions of ash trees. And it also actually feeds on the white fringe tree, the native white fringe tree, which you may not have known. This is a tree that we have here on campus. Really beautiful tree. This is just a depiction of an infestation of emerald ash borer. This was actually taken at Stanton River in Virginia in 2012. And this is where my boss would say, can anybody say firewood? Because it just looks like a lot of trees that can be used for firewood, but it's so sad to see all these ash trees die. We have on campus, I think like 1 or 2 ash trees that are alive, and that's because they're treated chemically very often, which we'll talk about that when we talk about management. And again, this is a forest stand setting where you're seeing infestations, but it's a really big issue in the urban settings too. You can see this is somebody thought it was a really great idea to plant. It's one thing that's really common in urban areas because it looks so pretty, right? Monoculture. But what happens when a pest comes through with monoculture? It's like a big buffet, right? This is the same street, And you see this emerald ash borer just completely wiped through all of those trees. And again, like I said, this pest is a problem both in urban and our forest setting. This picture I took at the Blue Ridge Discovery Center. They have like an ash tree graveyard behind the Discovery Center. And I thought this was neat because this tree is still standing. And if you stand at the bottom and look up, you can just see those S-shaped galleries the whole way up to the top. And if we look at a map in Virginia here, consequences as well. I mentioned that we only have 2 trees on campus that are alive, and that's basically because they kind of have like an IV. They have these plugs in them that they treat them with, and I think they leave the plugs in because they treat them so often. When we think about the management, I mentioned chemical control. They have to be retreated every 2 years. The Virginia Department of Forestry has a cost share program for homeowners to treat the trees at their houses under the consultation of an arborist. Again, tree removal is an option. Biological control is being investigated. There's 4 different parasitoid wasps from China and Russia that have been imported and studied. We've seen some impact in the North US, but not here in Virginia yet. So we're still looking for impact there. And again, this is another resource that they have an outstanding source, VDOF, of information on emerald ash borer in Virginia. So great resources. Ash recovery, what does that look like? Well, smaller trees have survived. We see some sprouting. So you can see here in this picture on the right, it's a tree that was kind of cut down, but you'll see that sprouting kind of occurring after the tree was cut down. So regeneration could be likely. And again, we're really hoping that these natural enemies being released will help also manage those populations. And it's really interesting that these natural enemies, parasitoids, can find those larvae through the bark, and they have specialized structures on their abdomen that allow them, they're specialized ovipositors, so they can pierce through the bark and find the larvae and parasitize them. It's super interesting. So kind of shifting gears because I think we're running a little bit out of time here, but hopefully we can make it through this. Laurel wilt and exotic ambrosia beetles. We'll talk about in the early 2000s, red bay trees along the coast in Georgia began declining. They were in the family Lauraceae. And these trees are actually normally found along the transition from beaches to forest zones where the soil's pretty sandy. The ambrosia beetle is a really small beetle that kind of look like a bark beetle here. You'll see in the middle picture. They carry a fungus that they use to colonize their egg galleries as they tunnel through this and create into the sapwood. They carry this fungi and they feed on it for food. And scientists actually determined that a non-native ambrosia beetle species was colonizing these red bays, and the fungus that they carried with them to feed on is pathogenic to the trees, which you may have heard of laurel wilt. So, but without this co-evolving with the fungi, these beetles can attack and kill live and healthy trees with the aid of the fungus. So, while they do attack dead and dying trees, they're pretty harmless to live trees. Without that fungus, they will attack and kill the live trees. This is the current distribution of the laurel wilt and the ambrosia beetle. You can see that it has spread since 2002, and it's actually spread up into Tennessee and Kentucky, which that's not the sandy soils that I was talking about. What it's actually, where you're not seeing the red bay, it can actually infest sassafras as well. So this is where they're seeing laurel wilt on sassafras. So it's been found in North Carolina, Tennessee, and Kentucky, and actually found in Scott County, Virginia in 2021. So there's really great potential for laurel wilt to keep expanding with, that expanded range of sassafras. We don't really have a way to manage this pest right now. There's a lot being investigated. Pathogens are really hard to manage in the forest setting. So definitely be on the lookout for sassafras declining. There's a lot of, again, VDOF resources. Don't move firewood. And I guess there's, they said they can protect trees with an injection of a fungicide, but it's only beneficial for healthy trees or shrubs, so not the declining ones. So I know I'm kind of running out of time here. I think we have like 5 minutes left. But the red imported fire ants are one I wanted to touch on. It's a little bit different of a pest. A lot of times, you think of like ants as being pests in your house, but ants are definitely pests in the field as well. So this is the red imported fire ants, and I've actually gotten to have hands-on with these guys. We have them in the quarantine facility here at Virginia Tech. They're native to Central South America, and they were first detected in, I think, either Alabama or Florida in the 1930s. And they think that they arrived accidentally through the port in Alabama. They're really nasty ants with terrible stings. I don't know if anybody's ever been stung by one, but it doesn't feel good at all. And what's really interesting is you think they're stinging you twice, but they also bite. So what they do is they bite you, and that's to secure themselves before they sting. So a lot of the times, you get the bite and you're like, ouch, and that's not even the worst part yet until they sting you. So they sting, they inject this alkaloid venom into the victim, and humans and other animals are susceptible to this venom. So I know some people that I work with are actually allergic to the fire ants, so they'll break out in hives after they get stung. So this map here just shows the worldwide distribution of the fire ants. Those red dots are really big, and it looks like they're all over Virginia, but if we zoom in, they're not all over Virginia yet. This is a little bit better of a map if you're looking at the bottom, the southern part of the US. So you can see they are now in Southeast Virginia, and they're continuing to expand. This is a really great map that I think it's I don't know if this map is VDOF or if it's actually the Department of Entomology created this one, but it's a really, really great graph where you can see the red area is the current quarantine for red imported fire ants in heavily infested areas. The orange areas are a widespread infestation, but it's not yet quarantine. And then the yellow is actually pockets of light infestation. So interesting that there's a pocket in like the southwest part of Virginia. But again, that could have just been an instance of they kind of hitchhiked their way over there. But they are continuing to expand. And what to do with these insects? Well, the most effective way to kill fire ants is a two-step method so far that they've come up with. So step one being fire ant bait. So it actually consists of a pesticide on processed corn grits coated with soybean oil. So worker ants take this bait back to the colony and they share it with the queen. And then she'll either die or become infertile. And the baits are actually currently available. They include, I think they're Amdro, Siege, Logic, I think Award, or Raid Fire Ant Killer. The baits are pretty slow acting, and they take weeks to months to achieve like 80 to 90% control. But the bait products can be used to easily treat large areas effectively, and they contain like extremely low amounts of toxins. Now, the second step is to use insecticide for targeting treatments on the mound. So this is with dust products. So no water is needed, and this acts pretty fast. They liquid drench. The liquid drenches basically eliminate the mounds within a few hours, and this kind of leaves little surface residue after the application. And that's the chemical. There's also organics. That's like basically pouring about 2 to 3 gallons of really hot boiling water on the mound, and that will kill ants about 60% of the time. And if it doesn't, they'll probably move to another location. So that's kind of the organic way. But again, I'm not sure how effective that is. I don't have fire ants here, so I haven't had to treat any mounds yet, but I'm assuming it's not super effective. I feel like they would just keep coming back. But it seems 60%, that's kind of promising. But again, be on the lookout for these ant mounds in areas where they're not present and report it if you see them. And clean logging and farm equipment or any equipment that you may use before you like leave a site that has fire ant mounds, because you don't want to drag a queen back with you and start a new infestation somewhere else. Two faculty members that are working at Virginia Tech, Dr. Shirk is actually studying their spread and distribution. And then Dr. Scotty Yang, he's studying the viruses that can impact their populations as well. So there's a lot of cool research since they're, still invading new areas on the fire ants. That's all I have for fire ants. And this is just a picture I wanted to show before we finish up of my forest entomology lab at Virginia Tech in the past couple years. Again, we mainly work on hemlock, woolly adelgid, but this is just what we love to do. And pictures of us out in the field at Bugfest, doing extension and outreach as well. And so I'd like to thank my lab for all the work they've done before me to allow me to work in the hemlock woolly adelgid realm and just the invasive species realm as well. It's super fascinating. So thank you guys for listening to me today, talk about some different pests. Hopefully you learned some new information and can take away something when it comes to management. And with that, this is my contact information, so you're more than welcome if I don't get to any questions today to reach out to me so I can send you those links as well. And with that, I'll take any questions. I don't know how we want to do this.
Great, thanks, Liv. If anybody has any questions, you can go ahead and type it into the chat, and I'll read them to you, Liv, so you don't have to try to
Yeah, that sounds good.
multitask.
Okay.
I did put into the chat, and
Yeah,
I'll
updated
show
map.
it that there is a updated ant map. It's out of Eric Day's lab,
Perfect.
and I pulled it up. I got it on a slide. I'll show it in just a minute.
Yeah, and if anybody is interested in any of those links, I can actually even just share my presentation with Ed or whoever, and they can send it out if that's interesting.
Yes, if you can share that with Devin, we can get that co-linked with the recording from today.
Okay.
So Devin asked, what would you recommend for homeowner control of HA, and which is or HWA? What is your treatment preference?
Yeah, so a lot of that is actually dependent upon time and like time of the year. So I know there's different times where you can use like hort oil control as well if you're kind of trying to steer clear of insecticides. What's really interesting too is I tell people all the time that you might actually have some biocontrol going on in your backyard and not even realize it. So we accidentally found a bunch of the Laricobius beetles in like town outside of Kroger. I go to Kroger and I collect the beetles from the hemlock trees. So you actually might have some biocontrol. But if you're looking to like chemically treat your trees, one of the students in our lab was looking at the different methods, right? Because there's soil drenches, there's the soil injections, the stem injections, there's all sorts of different treatments, right? And they do work. I mentioned that the soil treatments last longer than the stem injections. But if you're looking to preserve also your biocontrol agents that you may have, right? Like I mentioned, the beetles kind of live in the soil. And if you take and want to do a soil drench, right, and just dump a bucket of pesticide, you're also killing all those beneficial biocontrol agents that are in the soil. So one of our students actually just looked at the best chemical treatment in combination with biocontrol, and she found that the soil injection was actually, it lasts the longest in the soil, like it persisted, but it also bypassed the burrowing depth of the biocontrol agent. So the beetles were less affected by it. So you're able to treat the tree and also preserve your beneficial natural predators as well. But again, it's hard to say what the best option is because, hort oils are really, really great when the crawlers are out, right? Because it smothers them. But after they settle in and they insert their mouth part into the tree and they produce the wool, it kind of protects them from that oil. So I guess it depends on the year. That resource guide would be really, really great to look at.
Devin said thank you. And we've had a couple thank yous also in the chat from some other folks. If you are doing soil injection, that would be, you would have to hire a certified arborist
Yes,
that
yes.
can do the treatment that's not a homeowner treatment.
Yeah, good point. I forgot to mention that.
Liz wants to know, where did the resource guide come from?
Yeah, so I'm gonna pull that slide back up here. This resource manager's guide it was published, there's multiple authors on it, but it's a USDA publication through the Forest Service. It kind of encompasses the whole like IPM tactic that we're like all leaning towards, right? Because chemical control is not going to work solely at the forest stand level. It may work, in your backyard, but it's incorporating that chemical control and the biological control. So this is my advisor is actually an author on this publication, this manager's guide, and one of my committee members is also on it as well. But yeah, it was I think in 2020. But it's a USDA Forest Service. So this is open to the public as well, and you can download it. Yeah, I'll gladly share all of these links with you through the presentation, so you guys can have access to these. Yes, it does have the most, like, I guess the most recent info when it comes to, this is like our most recent manager's guide that we have published. It's quite a bit. I wonder if I have a copy of it. No, I don't have a copy of it here, but it's a pretty thick, resource manager's guide. But I know there's always pamphlets coming out as well. And I can dig up a pamphlet that may be more recent than 2020.
All right, do we have any other questions? Amanda asked, how do you manage fire ants in a garden? We have these.
Oh, where are you? Um, in a garden, that's a little bit different. Mecklenburg County. Okay. Um, I know the most effective way that they have here is that two-step method that I just pulled up, the baiting and mound drench. I don't know if that would be different, being in your garden. I don't know if you would really want bait or boiling hot water in your garden, and you really don't want chemicals as well. So I'm not sure, but what I can do is I can actually ask Dr. Yang, and he's the one that studies the fire ants the most, and I can always give you his contact information too, and you could reach out to him as well. But that's the only way that we know of right now to that's effective in killing them. Okay.
I would say reach out to Taylor Clark with the VCE office there in Mecklenburg to get some good treatment recommendations. The main thing with controlling fire ants is you want to do it correctly. If you do it incorrectly, what you end up doing is splitting the mound and you create a bigger problem. So you want to make sure that you are doing it correctly. And in a lot of the trainings that agents get from Eric Day, he said, all these things that you find on the internet, rice and whatever, do not work. If they worked, we wouldn't be seeing fire ants spread. What they're not good controls. What they do then is just create the mechanism for these fire ants to split their nest, take the queen, and move elsewhere, and make a bigger infestation. So reach out to the VCE office, and they'll give you the best controls working on there.
Oh, it looks like Devin said that Dr. Yang is a speaker, so stay tuned for Dr. Yang as well.
All right, any other questions for Liv? If not, let me change the share. So here is the current distribution map. And so you can see that it's spread quite a bit from that one that you had in
Oh, yeah.
2022.
Wow.
And you did mention all the way down here in the southwest part of the state, that did come in from Kentucky, and it is hybridized fire ants. So they are a special class all by themselves. So that's something you need to be aware of if you're going to those areas. So if you are in that quarantine area, you're kind of on your own. If you're in the not in the quarantine area and you do see fire ants, definitely report to your local extension agent and also to VDAX, because VDAX will do control if you are outside of the quarantine area.
Awesome.
And with that, that's the end of our presentation for today. Let's give Liv a great big thank you for coming today, and give you a heads up about our fantastic session coming up in May. On Tuesday, May 14th at 2 p.m., we'll be hosting a webinar on social media basics for EMG units. Our speaker will be Haley Conrad, who is the VCE Social Media Manager. Mark your calendars. We'll be setting out all the registration details in the next bi-weekly update, so keep an eye out for that. And with that, a big thank you again to Liv, and we'll see everybody at the next presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.